Hi, I'm Camilla. I live here, and it's very good to see you all. Thanks for coming. This is Alys, and I think you all know who Alys is, Alys Fowler. Thanks for coming. This is in a series of garden talks that we want to continue with. We've got 5 this year, and just Jane Power talked last week, and we've got some lovely things coming up over the next few Sundays. So do have a look at the programme if you've just heard that Alys is seeing. That's up for you. Thanks for coming. Good.
I am going to talk about bees, but also about insects and our kind of wider environment. 3 years ago now, I was invited to go to Edinburgh International Book Festival, and they said, would you like to come and talk about foraging, because I do a lot of urban foraging. And they said, we're going to put you together with this beekeeper who's written a book about beekeeping. And I got a series of very urgent texts from a beekeeper I'd never met saying that he was on a plane to Edinburgh and they were trying to take his honey off him. And he said, don't worry, I mean, I really didn't know this man at all. He said, don't worry, the honey will be there when you arrive. I've explained to them it's of international importance because it's an international affair. And don't worry, you'll have the honey. And I was thinking, okay, whatever. We agreed to meet in the street in Edinburgh and have lunch beforehand before we did the talk to discuss how we were going to get through the talk when we didn't know each other. And this wonderfully eccentric, brilliant-looking man appeared with this exquisite chunk of cone that came from Salisbury in England, which is actually where I grew up. So it came off a chalk flora, which is my childhood. And he said, here's my present to you. Here, have a look at this cone. And we did a talk. It was very funny, and he was a charming company. And then 3 days after the talk, he said, did you like the honey? I said, oh, it's the most beautiful honey I've ever tasted. Thank you so much. I went home with my special little bit of cone. And then he said, so should we write a book together? This guy is forward. I said, well, maybe. He said, yeah, I've got this brilliant idea. I found a Massey Ferguson tractor that used to belong to my uncle in Shropshire, and I'm going to drive it from Shropshire down to London and then plough up the parks and sow them with wild flowers. And I thought, you could cycle behind on your bike. What? Cycling behind you on a bike? And then I said, why do you want to do that? And we'll buy a narrowboat and we'll go down the canals together. We're married. Thank you very much. I'm going on a boat with you for the rest of the year. Anyhow, so after, he was very persistent and refused to give up. And he said, I know, I've got a much better idea. I'll give you some bees. I said, well, actually, I think I might be very allergic to bees. I don't think I want that. He said, well, fine, you can go and get tested for that. And he got me an appointment with a doctor. So there I was suddenly being tested to see if I was allergic to bees or not. Turns out that I was once allergic to bees, I'm now not allergic to bees. He said, fantastic, then I'm going to give you a hive. I said, okay, well now we have a bit more of an interesting book. But I'm not going to do all the work here. So if I have a hive, you need a garden. And he keeps his bees across Britain, in Shropshire, in Dorset, in Wales, but also on all the iconic buildings in London. So he keeps them at Tate Britain, the V&A, Fortnum and Mason's, White Cube Gallery, and keeps them on the roofs. And we persuaded Tate Britain that they should build a garden for his bees. So then that was the premise of our book. And then I wrote this in a kind of slightly mad moment, and I have no idea if our book actually accomplishes all of these things, but that was the idea. And we've spent almost 2 years writing the book now. It's going to come out in September. And it's a very alternative book. So I'm going to talk a little tiny bit about how we kind of got through the book, and then I'm going to go on to the sort of larger issue of why we started to see decline in our insect numbers and bees. So we funded the book through a new publishing company called Unbound, which meant that it was crowdfunded. So Unbound allows you as a reader to decide which book you would like to fund. And once you've reached the amount of money needed to get the book published, then off you go and write the book. We were the second fastest crowdfunded book and the history of crowdfunding books. So that was very, very pleasing. But then also slightly intimidating, because for the first time in my life, I know exactly who my audience is. I have a list of everybody who gave me a tenner to get my book out. And one of the things that we did was, because you know in crowdfunding you offer up various different levels. Tenner for a book, 50 quid, you can come and get drunk with us at our launch party. Give us 250 and I'll turn up at your garden. So about 15 people paid the top whack for me to come to their garden. So I spent, between writing this book, a lot of time going to travel to do other people's gardens. And it was a really interesting process because I had, I got to really know a couple of people who really helped the book in a very extraordinary way. One of the first gardens I did was for a designer, a graphic designer, down in Hampshire, and we had got on really well. And at the end of the day, she said, "I've so enjoyed, funding your book and funding you as a writer, and I'd really like to stay involved in the process. Is there anything that you need?" And I said, "Well, we have no budget, but we really need a designer for the book." And I knew that in her past life she designed books. So she said, "You know what? I have a young designer in my team who I'd really like to give the opportunity to do this. So that would be my extra present to the book. We'll design it for free." And it turns out that she's actually an extraordinary book designer. She's got an amazing career, will continue to, and has thrown a lot of love into making our book work, because the idea of the book was that Steve, the beekeeper, and I would write letters to each other over the course of the season, him teaching me how to keep bees, and me teaching him how to become a gardener. But we had a slight flaw, because he doesn't actually like writing letters. So I wrote endless letters and he wrote nothing out. And then we really kind of fell apart over that process. And actually, it's thanks to Lucy and her design team that she sort of brought us back together. So here are a few mock-ups of some of the style of the book, just because I think it's quite interesting to see how books are put together. So these are, so there's a series of letters, and this is slightly changed a bit, you can see it anymore, but I'm a flower, and he's a bee, and you know where you are on the page because there's either a flower or a bee, so you can see who's written to who. So there you go, that's the only letter I ever received. It says, it's 1:30 in the morning, and I just thought I'd write you a note on the back of a scrap of paper. But he did get better at writing as time went on, so you'll be glad to hear that he does actually feature in the book. And then we had endless text messages. What it turned out we were very good at is modern sort of technology. So then we thought maybe that's quite an interesting idea. Maybe we can play. Maybe it shouldn't all be letters. Maybe it should be all sorts of communication, sort of Skype calls, text, all of that. So there's the bee and the gardener, and we played around a lot with how bees communicate with each other and bees communicate with flowers. And hopefully, as the book unfolds, you kind of get a sense of some of their life. And then the designer has done a really lovely thing. So the pages change colour across the entire book. When you get to the very end of the book, there's a chart for all these different colours, and they're the different pollens bees take at different points of the year. So you can learn all these kind of secrets of the bees, I guess. And we've been doing lots of funny guerrilla gardening and all sorts of other things. This is the beginning of the Tate Britain garden, which we made at the start. And it's just flowering right now, and it looks really fantastic, so I feel very proud of that element. So that's the book, and it will come out in September, and you can buy it or not. But it has been a very wonderful, interesting process, and as I'm now in my 3rd year of beekeeping, I'm still a complete novice, but I have totally and utterly fallen in love with the honeybee. But in understanding about pollination service and what the role of pollinators are, it's very important to understand that the honeybee is not necessarily the most significant pollinator. So we have a very deep-rooted love for the honeybee because we get honey back, And therefore, we have prioritized the honeybee as one of the most important pollinators. But actually, there's a whole suite of other insects who are doing work, and it's very important when people talk about the bee decline that you don't consider it as only a honeybee issue, because bumblebees, solitary bees, hoverflies, butterflies, some beetles, all sorts of other things do pollination service, and they are just as important as the honeybee. And what you find, particularly if you look in Ireland and in England, hoverflies are actually very significant pollinators, particularly as you move further north. So the wetter the weather gets and the cooler the weather gets, it's actually hoverflies which are doing a significant part of pollination rather than bees, because on wet, cold days, it's very hard for the bee to go and fly. And worldwide, there is a huge decline in insect numbers. And as we know, you've seen a lot in the media, honeybees across the world are having a really hard time, but also all the other bees which are doing pollinator services are also seeing massive decline. Now, one of the reasons why honeybees are having a hard time is that there's the colony collapse disorder, which is mainly an American issue, where nobody quite knows what's going wrong, but the bees are clearly under a lot of pressure, and the colony just collapses. So it's doing fine, it's doing fine, it's doing fine, and then you turn up one day and the whole thing is dead. Nobody can quite pinpoint exactly what is causing this. However, we know that there are a number of issues that together mean that the bees in general and all other insects are having a very hard time. Now, we have a number of bee diseases, particularly honeybee, and we have a number of bee pests. So the Varroa insect, which you might have heard of, which is this tiny little red insect which basically attaches itself on the back of the bee and sucks its blood. Now, the Varroa insect can get into the brood. So the brood are the young larvae bees which live in the cells, and the other bees feed them, and then they are matured into honeybees or bumblebees or solitary bees, whichever ones you'll look at. And the moment Varroa is only found on honeybees, that there is an idea that it's now beginning to transfer to bumblebees. So the Varroa infects inside the brood cell, but it also can attach itself to the adults, which is how it moves around the hive. And it's essentially like the poor bee getting up every day, going to work with a huge rucksack on its back, full of weight, and then having to fly out and do its very complicated, hard job with all this extra weight. So the Varroa doesn't tend to kill the bee, it just puts so much more stress on it, it exhausts the bee. And when you look at all the other issues, having to carry a backpack full of weight is just a little bit too much, and this causes the colony to be under a lot of stress. So we have some diseases, we have a series of pests which are very problematic to the bee world. On top of that, there is not enough forage. So there's not enough food out there anymore, and that's largely because of agricultural practices that have changed in the last 60 or 70 years. So what we now have is a lot more monocultures of crops, so big, and I'm talking about the world, not just our homes here, but you have big crops, where there's huge, ginormous fields for as far as you can see with only one thing. Now, if I said to all of you guys, from here on in, all you can do is eat hamburgers, that's your only source of food. You might enjoy it for the first week, but I guarantee 3 months in, you'll be sick to death of eating hamburgers. I was going to say hangovers, but you can't really say hamburgers too. You feel very sick of eating hamburgers. You also start to show lots of deficiencies because you're not having a varied diet. And for any pollinator, the reason why they are going to the flower is to feed themselves. So flowers have evolved at the same time as insects to provide each other with a service. The flower gets pollinated and therefore reproduces, but the bee or the insect going to it gets a healthy diet. So it gets two things. It gets pollen, which is a really good source of protein. So that's very necessary for having sex for laying eggs and to give yourself energy to buzz around. And then it gets nectar, which is a really, really concentrated source of carbohydrates and sugars, which fuels the energy to do everything else in your life. So every insect that goes to a flower will either go to get some pollen, or it will go to get some nectar, and at different points, at different times in its life cycle, it will need more pollen or more nectar. We also know that bees go and collect lots of things to make propolis. Now, propolis is a kind of, it's a bit of bee genius. So propolis can be used in any kind of their architectural buildings, so it's a glue to fix things. It's also a medicine to feed to each other. So when bees are feeling great, they feed each other different kinds of propolis. And they use it within their own hive. So they'll plug up gaps if things break down, but they'll also use propolis to fix things within the nature of creating the comb and all of that. And propolis is collected from essential oils from plants, largely from trees. So they will go and collect various different exudates coming out of the trees, sap and stuff like that. And then they collect it, carry it in their stomach, regurgitate it in a concentrated level, and they mix it up from all sorts of different things. So it really is a bee medicine. It allows them to make a cough mixture when they have a bad cough. It allows them to make something to get rid of their hangovers, and so on and so forth. So when they're visiting the flowers, they're going there for food, flowers are getting pollination service in return, and this is essential. So foraging out there needs to be a very varied experience. They need to be able to get lots and lots and lots of different types of nectar and different types of pollen. And unfortunately, what our agricultural system has done is limit the amount they can have. And some of the most important things for particularly wild bees are weeds. So those margins on the fields, those margins on the sides of roads and whatnot, they are a really key source of field, and in the last 50 years we have become hell-bent on ridding ourselves of weeds. And that's part of the issue. So, there's diseases they don't like, there's pests they don't like, there's not enough forage, there's also not enough clean water. You'd be amazed how much a pollinator needs to drink in a day. Now, they need to drink because if they're doing something like producing honey, they need a lot of, they're taking sugar from the plant, they need to then mix that and ferment that with water in order to turn it into their product. So they need water to do that, they need water to build wax and to build their homes. They also need a lot of water to cleanse their system. And one of the things that we now know about pollinators is, if they are visiting a field which is very limited in forage, and then that field is covered head to toe in pesticides, fungicides and fertilizers, what's essentially happening to the poor pollinator is that they go and get breakfast, lunch or supper, and they also get this chemical cocktail. And this chemical cocktail is making them very, very ill. We know neonicotinoids, I should have chosen something else, are particularly bad, which is why there is a ban across Europe using them at the moment. We have enough studies to show, once you remove all the politics of the argument, if you actually look at the science, that very much there is hard evidence to show that that group of pesticides are making the bees very muddled in their brain. It affects their memory. Now, the problem is that when we use pesticides, we don't just use pesticides, we use fungicides, and we also use fertilizers on our crops on top of that. And the combination of these different chemicals is like giving the pollinator. Imagine if I took you all out tonight and I made you drink the bar dry. So you were so unbelievably drunk from the experience of hitting the bar or a field out there. And then I said, okay, now you need to get home, but first of all, I'm going to walk you up the hill, spin you around 101 times, let you sleep for a couple of hours, and then let's see how quickly you get home. Some of you would still get home, and that's remarkable. Some of you would just lie there going, man, my head hurts, I'm going to have to think about it for another 7 hours. And some of you would walk off in the wrong direction, and you'd walk for miles. Now, we're fine, we can survive really quite a long time without food, but most wild bees only have about 30 to 50 minutes before they need to start eating again. Now, I am giving you the worst hangover you've ever had. You also need to go home and you need to find food. That is a horrible prospect. That's their daily experience on going to a kind of modern agricultural field. So, the one thing that when you're really hungover you want is to drink a lot of water, right? You want to flush your system out. The bees need to get to a clean source of water, and unfortunately a lot of our farm sources of water, so farm ponds, streams, places like that, have a lot of runoff from the fields, so they are no longer a clean source of water. When they desperately need to flush out their system, they're just getting a little bit more of the rubbish they don't need. So, diseases, pests, fields without enough food in them, too large a field without enough variety, not enough clean water, and then for the wild bees, not for the honeybees, because clearly we make their home, there isn't enough nesting sites either. And all of these problems together have put them in this incredibly serious position where we have huge decimation to insect numbers, and you can see that across the world. Now, that's bad for us because we don't get to eat strawberries and tomatoes and apples, so there's a real issue there. But it's a real issue for the whole wider ecosystem, because the reason why we have such huge numbers of insects is that they're the base layer of feeding everybody else. So the wild birds that eat all the insects, every animal that then has to go and eat an insect now has less insects to eat. And across the system, that is a very serious issue. A tropical bee in, let's say, Mexico, you probably 90% of your diet comes off trees, and therefore you speak a tree-based language. But if you're an Irish native honeybee, and actually you will have a mixture of trees, but also meadow flowers and wildflowers, then your language is based around that. So you know the honeybee dance. So it goes off in a certain direction, it comes round in a loop, and then it does a wiggle down like that. Now, the dance is actually a series of movements and noises emitted together to explain to the rest of the hive where they've been. And the dance is predominantly, there's a very interesting thing which the dance has evolved around the hive. So if the honeybees were making wild comb in a tree, which is what they would have originally done in warmer climates, they would make more noise than they would dance. No, the other way around. They would dance more than they would make noise. They have to make noise and dance in a honeybee because it's black inside. So you have the vibrations of the dance, but the noise also tells you what's going on. So in the dance, you go off in the angle that you give your dance and the orientation of the hive tells every other bee which direction you went. So you say, so that angle there says, I went northwest. I went northwest, but it's incredibly accurate on which direction. So you stand around, you see this bee doing the dance, and all the other bees come around and look at it and went, oh, okay, they went off in that direction. This loop of the dance says how far they went, and can go around several times if necessary. So I went northwest for 3.1 miles. And then this last wiggle in the dance tells you exactly where I went to. So I went northwest for 3 miles. There, depending on the intensity of the wiggle, I either found, so if it was a tree, the wiggle would be very large here and then it would be very intense at the end. If it's a meadow, the wiggle is incredibly intense here and then it goes like that. If you are a honeybee and you're being sent to a tree, trees refill their nectar in their flowers incredibly quickly because they're a huge resource with masses of roots. So within 10 minutes, all the nectar that's been taken off the tree will refill the nectar up. Right? There's not a limitless supply. The nectar sits in the flower, and then when it's removed, the plant goes, oh, I have to refill the nectar up again. So it's a bit like going to, a drink station. And in a tree, you can say, right, I'm sending you northwest for 3 miles. There's a whole bunch of trees. All of those trees are lovely. I happen to go to, and this is where the intense riddle comes, I happen to go to this tree over here, and it was really exciting. And if you went to the very top of the tree, oh my God, you should see the flowers there. They're amazing. You should go and pull all of those flowers. And oh, Jesus, they're the best one so it goes and does this dance. If you went to a meadow, you'd say northwest, 3.1 miles. I got to the meadow. The meadow is amazing. You've never seen so many flowers in your life. It's an extraordinary experience. You're just going to have heaven. Oh, yeah, I can't remember which flower I went to. Who cares about which flower I went to? The meadow was nice. That's because in a meadow it takes at least 45 minutes for any flower to refill. Now, the bee can easily get home in that 45-minute period, so it doesn't want to send its sister to the flower it's just gone to see, because there won't be enough nectar there. So it gets all wobbly and vague, because it's kind of like, go search for your own flower. I found mine, you go look for yours. Now, the extraordinary thing about this is, so you do this intense dance, and everybody listens around and goes, that's great. And then they go, yeah, but you've always been a good storyteller. Give us some of that nectar. We want to see how good this thing you're going on about is. So bees have 2 stomachs. They have a stomach that they fuel themselves off, so they eat off, and they have a storage stomach, which they put the nectar into, and they cannot feed themselves. So every bee has to be fed by another bee. And so then she regurgitates her nectar. She says, look at my great story, and they say, okay, let's try it. And they try the nectar, and this is a really cruel part of the honeybee world. But if they don't think your nectar is very good, nobody listens to your story. so if they think your nectar is great, they take the dance, and they go and do it somewhere else to tell everybody else down the hive. Now, when you open up a natural hive with all those beautiful foundations on them, now, we keep bees in a very structured, straight, we keep them in those frames and they're square, and we often put pre-formed foundation, which says the cell is this big. That's because it allows us to take a lot more honey off the system. If you make bees produce their own comb, you lose at least 1/4 of your honey because the energy has to go into building wax. So we've evolved the system where we can take as much honey as we can possibly do off the bees. If you leave them in their own, if you leave them in a warrior hive or a top bar hive where you allow them to produce their own foundation, you get less honey. And if you leave them in the warrior hive in particular, which is literally just a box and you allow them to do whatever they want inside, the combs are incredibly beautiful and they look very, very, very different from those square foundations. So you have that beautiful hexagonal comb thing that everybody recognises about the foundation. But what you find is it's often in a tear shape. It's nearly always slightly curved, like that, because that's a structurally much stronger thing than a straight line. And it has these extraordinary bits within it, which are, when you see them, and when you have to break them, which you inevitably end up having to do in lots of different hives, I mean, it's quite heartbreaking, but they make these amazing sound tunnels. So they make holes so they can get back and forth through so they'll just literally make a random hole so that they can all get to one end of the hive quickly and the other hive. That's fine. Every now and again, they take the comb and they curve it back and they make this little cave. That's so when they're doing their dance and they're doing their squeaks, the sound is amplified through the whole thing, so they communicate really quickly. So if you're one end of a huge hive, you can't necessarily hear or see that dance or even feel the vibrations of it. But with these beautiful caves, they've learned to amplify and move the sound across them. I mean, it's an extraordinary world when you get into it. This means that they are so much more effective than any other pollinator. In fact, if you're really honest, honeybees can be essentially, they're almost like the most efficient multinational corporate bank you've ever met. And they can be quite lazy during the day because they're so efficient at communicating with each other. They send out scouts to go find food. The scout comes back, does that dance that I told you about, offers up some of the nectar. Everybody says, yeah, man, we're into this nectar. And then the whole hive goes, right, go to work. And off they go, and when you see one of those hives, you see that mass exodus of bees moving the whole time. They're really smart. They know by lunchtime they probably have eaten most of the nectar of their source of field, so they just kind of hang around. They fly around a bit, they come back to the hive, they do some housework in the hive, they clean out, they have an argument. They have a lot of arguments, as you imagine. They do all those things and then they go, oh, okay, it's the evening again, let's go out. When we know all the nectar's going to be refilled in that space, let's go do another really hard graft and go back to bed. Now, they have an extraordinary system, an amazing colony that allows them to be efficient, and they all know their place and they all know exactly the job they should be doing. Bumblebees, who are the other largest group of social bees, are kind of really sweet, slightly, it's not right to call them dim, but they're such bumblers about their work that they have a much, much harder time. So what happens is, in a bumblebee's life, only the queen overwinters. So nobody else, only one bee overwinters. And that big fat bumblebee that you see flying around with big pollen baskets right now, that's the queen of this year who's searching around for a new nest to get going and build her colony. The largest bumblebee colony is about 200 individuals. The largest honeybee colony can get up to 60,000 individuals. So you have to see the difference in efficiency there. So the bumblebee queen, there's one there, just going out, just on that flower, just there, you can see. Right now you'll only see really big fat bumblebees, that's because they're pretty much all queens, searching around. So she spends the winter hidden, either in the soil, which will dig herself a little place to go and sleep, or, you know, depending on the species, some of them like bits of your shed, some of them go under floorboards, some of them decide to sleep in flower pots. You know, they are delightfully eccentric about where they decide to spend the winter. But they spend the winter asleep in a kind of stasis. The minute wherever they are warms up, they come up, out. They often are carrying, if you look at bumblebees right now, you'll see that they have a series of mites around their neck. And everybody's always worried that they're some kind of parasite. They're not, they're the bumblebees' house cleaners. And at the end of the season, these mites that live in the bumblebee nest hitch a lift to the queen. They jump around her collar and hang on to her like this amazing ruff on her neck. And they go down to wherever she goes to sleep. And then she crawls up, carrying all the weight of all these little individuals on her, flies around, does her job. When she starts a new nest, they all drop off her neck, which is why you only see them at this time of year and you don't see them later on. And they start to do the housework. Bumblebees are the messiest bees you can ever imagine. They have no sense of cleaning up or housework whatsoever. But these mites go around eating all their rubbish. So it's a really lovely, beneficial relationship. So the bumblebee has emerged from spring, and first of all, what she needs to do is fly around and eat. That is why it's really important that you have spring flowers in your garden, because she has spent all winter on what the last meal she had in autumn, and she is starving when she comes out of that. She also has a very short window. She has 2 hours to find food, or she will die. So she's up, coming around, and she's desperately searching for your snowdrops and your bluebells and your early spring flowers. They are so important. She feeds up as much as she possibly can. At this point, she's really only taking on nectar. So she's taking on carbohydrates for energy. She feeds and feeds and feeds. And then, when you see her with these ginormous pollen baskets on the side of her leg, that's when she's decided to find a nest. So she feeds herself up and loads of Coke, essentially. Nectar is very, very, very similar to drinking Coke. It's got a lot of caffeine and a lot of sugar. And then she starts searching for a nest. Now, because she's on her own, so she's not like that big colony of honeybees. Now, the honeybee colony drops down to about, well, it depends on how big your colony is, but it can drop down to about maybe 2,000 individuals over the winter. It's 2,000 more than her, right? There's only one of her out there. So she cannot build a nest on her own. What she does is look for mice and shrews and the homes of these guys that they have used last year and left out. And she has an extraordinary nose. She can tell within a 3-mile radius whether there's been any mice nests. And when you see that big fat bumblebee going low across the ground, doing a very slow, slightly ponderous flight, what she's doing is smelling. Has there been a mouse around here? And then when she smells something that she thinks smells mouse-like and it looks like a hole, she goes down into the hole and explores it and says, yeah, maybe not, no, I'm a better realist. Until she finds the best mouse nest she possibly can. The reason why they particularly like mice nests is because they make nice, fluffy, insulated little nests. And so that's a perfect place for her to start off. So she finds one, hopefully there's still not a mouse in it, otherwise you can imagine what happens there. And then she starts to rearrange the mouse nest into a nice little bed. Then she starts going out and only collecting pollen. She collects these huge baskets on the side of her legs. When she's collected enough pollen, she goes back into the nest and she builds her own individual nest. So she takes that pollen and she, with a little bitter, makes a little tiny wax cup. And then she takes the other pollen and she kneads it into bee bread. So she takes pollen and her spit and she ferments it just the same way we make sourdough bread, so that the pollen won't go off. And then she makes these little tiny balls of bread and sticks them around her cup. And then she goes out, she drinks up as much nectar as she can, she comes back, she fills up her tiny little wax pot with a little nectar, she puts a lid on top of it, and then she sits down and she lays her first set of eggs. She will lay 6 eggs initially, so two sets of 3, and then, like a mother hen, she sits on her eggs, and she takes the heat of her body, and she starts to whir, so she starts to buzz, until she incubates these eggs at the right temperature for them to hatch. And she sits there, and she cannot leave until they hatch. And when she gets hungry, she eats a little bit of her tiny bread, and when she gets thirsty, she drinks a little bit of her honey, and she whirs away. Now, she can be doing this really early on in the season when it's very cold, and her nest might be, still below 10 degrees, and yet she has to keep those eggs at roughly 32 degrees. So she's using up a huge amount of energy to do this. She gets the first lot going, she takes the rest of her bread and she feeds it to her young, and she feeds them nectar, and they very rapidly make the first set of bees, her first set of workers. She then, if the workers, and she can keep the nest, if everything is right about it and it's insulated enough, she quickly goes out and has a proper feed herself, and she then lays another set of, so she makes some more cells, that they put the brood in, she lays her next set, and by the time she's on to her third set, she now has workers who can do the job for her, and she doesn't leave the nest ever again. She just sits in there making wax, little wax cells to lay her brood, and that's what she'll do for the rest of the summer. At the end of the summer, she'll die, and a new queen will come out, get mated, feed for a little bit, and then dig their hole back into the ground in winter, and that's how the cycle goes, over and over and over again. Her life is very, very precarious. She does an extraordinary amount of pollination service for us, and yet she has that 2-hour window in the spring to live or die. Huge amount of bumblebees never make it through their cycle. Right? They don't find the right nest, somebody else moves into the nest, a cuckoo bee, so there's lots of bees that act just like cuckoo birds do, come in, knock all her eggs out, and then lay their own version, and she's so kind of confused by it all that she brings them up. She has a very precarious life, and her workers have a very precarious life, because they also only have sort of a half-hour to 1-hour window of feeding. Because they don't have such an efficient communication system as the honeybee, they have to go and work all day long. Now, the problem with this is we like honey more than we like bumblebees. And that's the statement that we all, probably a lot of this room, had honey on their breakfast this morning, or put it in some facial product on their face, or had it in some drink last night, right? We use a huge amount of honey in this world. And every time you put a honeybee population into a native wild bee community, it's like saying, okay, there's a beautiful meadow out there and all sorts of animals are living off it, and then I'm going to come and use my cows to graze it. Honeybees are just like cows. They are a farmed insect, and every time you put 60,000 individuals into your ecosystem, you are impacting on all the wild bumblebee population, and all the wild solitary bee population, and all the wild hoverflies, and all the wild butterflies, because they're too efficient at eating. Now, if we go right the way back to the beginning of the argument, most of our modern agriculture is not a good meal. We now put a very efficient insect who can eat what there is far more than everybody else, and our poor wild pollinators are suffering even more. The biggest problem about all of this is that none of the fungicides or pesticides or fertilizers have to be tested on anything other than one species of social bumblebee. So we know what those terrible things do to the honeybee because we're very concerned with getting a lot of honey back. We have started to test, and you do have to test your pesticides on the bumblebees, but you test on those bumblebees which are in the laboratory. They are not out in the real world. A laboratory bumblebee does not behave like an outdoor real world bumblebee. And we have no idea what half of these pesticides, fungicides or fertilizers do to solitary bees. Nobody has to test them on beetles. Nobody has to test them on frogs. Nobody has to test them on hoverflies. Nobody has any idea what these pesticides do to any of those things on their own, let alone when you mix them all together. And so essentially, every day we go out and kill a large part of our insect population just because we let multinational corporations decide on our farming practices. And that cocktail is very problematic because there's the half-life of how long it takes those chemicals to break down. So neonicotinoids have a 27-year half-life before they break down. We have been using them for about 20 years, but maybe on a kind of on a big scale for the last 10 years. For the next 30 years, any plant grown in a field where those pesticides were used will take up those chemicals and run right the way through the plant cycle for 30 years. Every golf course in the world has about 120 years worth of that pesticide in them. Every cheaply produced bedding plant that you go and buy, exactly the same thing. Every Dutch bulb of tulip for the entire life will have that pesticide in it. So we have a group of insects that desperately need our help. And we have ensured for several of our generations they won't have a clean meal. And that is hugely complicated. And as you can tell, I find overwhelming. Some nice mating butterflies to cheer us up a little bit. Lovely shield bugs, because unfortunately they take up those things too, but they're not bad. I'm going to depress you a tiny bit more, and then I'm going to try and bring us back around to a much happier place. My grandparents remember a childhood of fields full of insects, of butterflies and bees. They just remember being flooded by the experience of so many walking through a field and it just alighting in front of you. My mother remembers so many butterflies, and she can name so many more than me. I go to a garden where I'm lucky if I see maybe 10 species, and probably only 5. The problem is we take our childhood experience and say that that's the baseline. So when we say to our children, oh, you should have seen it in my childhood, what we need to do is remember that it's our grandparents' experience that matters, not ours in this, and that's where we need to be fighting for. So in the UK, you know, we have seen a 40% decline in certain kinds of butterflies. We see the same in a lot of different insect groups. What matters is that, you know, the past is a foreign country and they did do things differently there. And we have to fight for our grandparents' experience, not ours. Because at the moment, when those companies like Syngenta argue that neonicotinoids, without the use of that, we're going to have huge crop failure and we're all going to go hungry, we have to remember what our grandparents experienced and fight for that, not our experience right now, because we will shift and shift and shift, and before we know it, we will have a very impoverished system. So, how are we going to get out there? This is a lovely, lovely beech tree near where I grew up. on a really old, ancient hill fort. And it's extraordinary. There's a ring of them all the way around. And it's an amazing tree in itself. If you've got the rest of the afternoon off, I've never seen some more beautiful trees than some of the trees out here. So go out, have a look at these great big old beasts, and realise this: nobody ever gave that tree any fertiliser. Nobody had to pour any kind of chemicals on it to get it that big and that successful. That's because it is inherently fixed in a system where it needs to do everything. Everything it needs is already there. The point about nature and the point about soil is we do not need to add our own muddled ideas about what feeding is. Every soil across the world, apart from about 3 or 4 deserts where there's literally just sand, has all the fertilizer to grow any plant for the rest of time already in it. So that when you are putting fertilizers on your field, they are not necessary. There is more available nitrogen, phosphorus, and all the other nutrients we need in any soil inherently within the system. They only don't feed if they do not have enough of the right biology, if there's not enough of the right kind of microbes and fungi and protozoa. So there's no need for fertilizers, ever. What you need is to promote more life, not less. And the problem is, with our modern agriculture, is we do not behave like these great old trees. Now this tree, and any very ancient tree within a system that hasn't been messed with, there are certain trees that act as mother trees, and they communicate with the entire, they're in cahoots with the entire world. Through their roots, they are endlessly talking to everyone. And through their leaves, we now are starting to know in the last 5 years there's been a huge amount of research to show that plants send out endless chemical signals all day long to tell the world what's happening around it. And these signals, and both through the roots and coming out through the leaves, tell the world what state they're in, what they need, and then they respond to other plants. So for instance, if you have a long hedge, and you start cutting it one end, right, like a big ancient old beech hedge, for instance, and you decide to come along and cut it because you want it to look like a nice crisp hedge right now behind us, then that plant on that end says, oh my god, there's the most ginormous herbivore eating us, and it whips, and you can follow this with isotopes down the entire hedge, so that the very last one in the end of the row starts emitting chemicals to say, I am being eaten by something. Can the people who help me out come and see me? And plants do this all the time. You know when you smell cut grass, that extraordinary scent of the smell of summer. That's a long-chain carbohydrate being shortened into a short-chain carbohydrate. That smell is addictive to us. It's a flavour that we love, and that's one of the reasons why in herbs and lettuce and whatnot, we really, really intensely enjoy the flavour of that short-chain hexanol. But actually what it's doing is sending out a chemical signal to predators, mostly wasps. That signal can float for miles saying, hey wasp, I am being eaten by some pest that you like to eat. How about you come over and get rid of that pest for me? So all day long they tell everybody everything. These wasps can smell that long chain be cut down to a short chain, and they go, oh, look, there's clearly some soft-bodied insects eating grass over there, let's go over. Now, clearly in a good system, that's amazing. Now imagine if you're a wasp and you get there and you find it's actually a man mowing the lawn. You can't eat a man. So you go, well, that's not very good single. Yeah, I'm not going to listen to that one next time. So there's some man-made issues on top like that, but what's much more problematic is what's happening in the soil when you use fertilizers, when you use pesticides, when you use fungicides. The plant stops talking with the soil. And when the plant stops talking with the soil can never respond back again. Well, it can respond within time if you know the system. So when the going is good with fertilizers, when you look at post-war use of fertilizers, we had a massive boom in our population and the amount of agriculture we could do around the world. We took soils that we never knew how to grow stuff off, and by using nitrogen fertilizers, by adding phosphorus, by putting loads of potassium into the system, we could grow food everywhere. And you see that all over the place. If you look at agricultural use between pre-Second World War and post-Second World War, and that's the introduction of nitrogen through bombs, that's how that whole chemistry came about, you see that agriculture explodes. You see that there's suddenly huge fields happening left, right, and centre. You know, if you look at a map of Britain or you look at a map of Italy post and pre-war, it's extraordinary. We suddenly start farming up into hill country that was never any good. We farm into places we never, ever could grow corn in. We could never grow wheat. Through these application of these fertilizers, we grow them, and for about 40 years we have a grand time on it. We produce a lot of food. We have a ginormous population boom across the world, and then we start to have real issues. And then we start to make pesticides and insecticides and fungicides to deal with all these issues. Now, when the going is good and the pesticide works and the nitrogen fertilizer works, we have a nice time. But after a while, nature starts to adapt to all of that problem, and our pests become immune to our pesticides, or our weeds become resilient to the herbicides we are using. And when the plant desperately needs help, it can't. When you have used chemicals on plants, it can no longer communicate with the soil around it than it needs to do. So, left alone, when a plant photosynthesizes, within 3 seconds it gives itself all the energy it needs to grow, but it's only using a tiny percent of all the carbohydrates it's making. So you understand the principle of photosynthesis, you take sunlight, you take oxygen, you take carbon dioxide, you make carbohydrates. You feed yourself, and in 3 seconds you then dump all these sugars out your roots. It's an extraordinarily fast process. Why is a plant making so much food, only using a tiny bit for itself, and then dropping the rest in the soil? What's the point of that? The point about that is the plant at the edge of its root tips is feeding a whole lot of bacteria and protozoa and fungus and fungal, various different fungal bodies, mycorrhizal fungal, and a whole world of microbes. Now those microbes take in the sugar, build their world, and then they do this amazing, extraordinary thing. So it's only attracting certain kinds of microbes to the edge of its root tip. It's a tiny, tiny, microscopic little bit of the world. It's building a shield. So every time it feeds these guys, it's literally like putting a force field down around the roots. And when the bad pests and diseases appear, particularly diseases at soil level, they can't get through the shield. The plant is using the microbes to create and protect its world. As long as the microbes are doing well, it can say, hey, I'm having a hard time up here because somebody's eating me. And the roots go, don't worry, we'll put out a whole load of new roots, we'll get you a load of energy, we'll take up a lot more water, we'll grow you that leaf you left. If you use a chemical, none of that communication happens anymore. So when the going is good and the chemicals are taken up quickly, it doesn't matter, but when the plant gets itself in a really damaged position, it no longer has any of the resources to build up. And we are depleting our soils. This is the international. We are depleting our soils in 2 ways. We are killing off essential microbes. We have lost an amazing world. Now the good thing about that is they can be rebuilt in a day. One single day you can get your soil on the beginning to the road of recovery. But we're also eroding it by ploughing. Now these microbes in this extraordinary world that lives around the root system, if I just flick on, so I don't know if you can see that this is, you guys know this if you've ever dug up in your garden. Some roots are big, some roots are small, some roots are wide, some roots live on the top of the surface, some roots live way, way, way down to the base. And all of these roots are communicating. Every time they're communicating with each other, they're communicating with the microbes. There's a whole lot of talking happening beneath our feet. But every time you plough, you break up that source of communication. And those tiny little microbes that are living on the tip of your roots do not want to suddenly find themselves on the surface of the world. So when you have soil, what you have is you have the top biological level is in the top 5% of all soils. It's very shallow, and the microbes that live on the very top level like to live in a world full of oxygen. And the microbes that live, these are tiny, tiny, tiny things. So the microbes that live a little bit further down live in a less oxygenated world. And the ones that live like a spade's worth down have definitely oxygen in their system. Don't believe that they're not using it. They don't use it very much. When you dig and you turn your soil on its head, or when you plough and you flip it, you put all the things that want to live in a low oxygen world in a really highly oxygenated world, and you put all the things that want to have a lot of oxygen in a low oxygen world, and the microbes die off. You can see this every time you dig. You dig this beautiful brown soil, and then you come back half an hour later and it's got a grey cap across it. That's microbes dying off. You just suffocated a whole layer of life. So imagine what happens when you plough a field for 50 or 60 years. You not only start to really disrupt all of that microbial activity, also allow a lot of carbon dioxide back up into the atmosphere. And we all know we do not need any more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere anymore, because that's one of the issues with climate change. So there's a strong argument, and lots of people get very upset about the term conventional in modern agriculture, because there's nothing conventional about it. It's a very, very short history of how our agricultural practices have changed, of using pesticides, of ploughing at the levels we did, of ploughing to the extent we did. There is now a new world called no-till or no-dig. This is about leaving soil that has had a millennia to invent itself and doesn't need us in the last 50 years to decide we had a better plan, in the place it needs to be. So no-till agriculture is extraordinary because it's going to promote and keep soil in the place it is. It's going to improve water runoff. It's going to stop the degradation of soil. At the moment, we have degraded our soil so badly in the UK that we probably have about 20 to 30 crops left across most of our fields. Now, that wouldn't matter if it didn't take 500 years to make good agricultural soil. So, we can get back to a better place, but we have to work very, very, very hard, we have to work very, very, very fast, and we have to accept that our next generation is going to have a very hard time by the consequences of our past reactions. That doesn't mean we can't get to a better place, but we need to do it immediately. We don't need to do it next year, which is why the UN decided to make this the International Year of the Soils. And no-till has, 5 years ago, 10 years ago I started working on no-till agriculture. 5 years ago you could go to a like-minded party and say no-till and people would know what you're doing. Now you can open the paper and people are finally, America is adopting no-till quicker than anybody else because they have, and they can see another dust bowl occurring in their water issues around places. So the thing is, what you will find is that when you go to the supermarket, and I always feel kind of hard to talk about some of this here because in a lot of ways there's great agriculture in Ireland and there is a lot of pasture-raised animals. But what you need to do every time you make a food choice where you can about buying food is that you need to look for pasture or grass-raised animals. So those are animals that are kept on permanent pasture and are fed grass rather than being fed corn that comes through a till process. So that's one of the things that we need to do. No-till agriculture is also now starting to be done for corn and all the rest of our crops. Every time anybody says they don't dig or they don't till, go give them a bit more money. Because they're doing some pretty awesome stuff. A little bit of, I don't think I'm getting into it, a little bit of permaculture, a little bit of polyculture. So there's not just, agroecology is a new kind of form of farming, which is actually a very, very, very ancient form of farming, so there's nothing new about it whatsoever, but we're giving it some nice cool names. So, not everything is about eating food from fields where you have to plough. There is an awful lot of different systems that can be used to produce our apples and our more perennial crops, which allow, again, to promote this really great soil and with this great soil, great flowers. And I know you're probably thinking, well, we've all gone off from this distant conversation about soil, but I thought I came to hear about bees. Every time a plant is grown in pesticides on these fields, you do not need to over-fertilise these fields, you do not then need to add poor pollinators for a load of rubbishy food. They start to have places that they can live in again and feed in again. So those things matter. This is a tiny example of a very small picture where you can't see it, the fact that polyculture works really well, even on a small scale, in my tiny urban back garden. So here is an apple. Underneath the apple grows some rhubarb. Underneath the rhubarb grows some wild strawberries. The idea of polyculture is that you use the different layers to promote a very rich, biodiverse ecosystem and then get food off it. There's some flowers. I eat amazing amounts of apples. I do not want to see another stick of rhubarb this year. I gorge all summer long on various different herbs and strawberries and whatnot. I never, ever, ever dig my garden. My soil is left exactly where it is. I do not dig my allotment. I have a garden that is not as good as my grandparents, but I'm getting there in terms of the amount of things that buzz and move. I take great joy in walking into my garden about 11 o'clock in the morning and just listening to the whole thing buzz and sing and hum. And it's a really joyous experience to realise that the garden's just moving on its own way. And I don't dig. I make my own homemade compost. I spread it on in the spring and the autumn. You really need a very, very, very thin layer of very well-made homemade compost to put all those microbes back into your soil. That's how you fix it in a day. You make your own compost. You spread it on the soil. You do not dig it in. You just leave it there. I guarantee within a day, those microbes start coming back into your system, and after several years, you have some really great soil. And the University of Sheffield just published a paper this year saying the very best agricultural soil in Britain is now on allotments. Allotments and back gardens hold the finest quality agricultural grade 1 soil, and they hold more of it than anywhere else in Britain. So the point about being a gardener is, yes, you're doing it on a very, very tiny scale, or if you're these kind of gardeners, on a really big scale, but you know, most of us are doing it on a small scale. That small scale really matters, because that one individual allotment holder who's just been going around life in a mumbling way, probably digging quite a lot, but not digging so much, because everybody knows most allotmenters end up in the pub at 3 o'clock, has been keeping and promoting and holding on to this thing they never even knew they were doing. They've been protecting a really precious resource. So compost is the very, if you're going to, nobody can solve these problems on their own. There needs to be policy to inform change around farming so that we use less pesticides and insecticides, and we don't go around ploughing and all of that, but we can make individual choices which will promote all of that and push and make a vote for it. So what you need to do is eat less meat. Most of our meat is fed off not pastures but other food grown in different fields, and those fields tend to have lots of pesticides and ploughing and all of that. So if you chose to eat less meat, if you chose one day a week to be a vegetarian, you would across Europe save soil the size of Belgium within a year. So be a vegetarian one day a week. If you can do 2, 3 or 4, good on you. Please don't end up eating a lot of bad soy products from the other way around the world though. Waste less food. Now at home it's quite easy to make sure that, well it's not easy, but you can at least be in control of wasting less food. The biggest food waste comes from catering. It comes from, catering's not fair to say that, but it comes from those places like the train station where you buy a rubbishy sandwich you don't quite like eating, you only eat half of it, but before that sandwich was even made, so much food waste in that, so much food waste in the kind of wider institutional food world. Not so, high-end restaurants aren't an issue, it's McDonald's ordering, so McDonald's regularly, I spoke to a farmer a few weeks ago, grows a field of lettuce. Perfect, there's little gem lettuce, perfect little gem lettuce to go in every single burger. It uses less than 1/3 of the field. And it says the rest of it doesn't look right, doesn't fit in with its system, and it just jumps it. In fact, it doesn't even do anything, it just leaves it in the field. There you go, food. You know, it's just ludicrous. You can't do that. So we need to waste less food, make sure you make good choices when you're outside of your home. When you're at home, the food that you do waste needs to be made into homemade compost. So if you don't home compost and you want to help the bees out in any small way, don't get a beehive. Don't even worry about honey or anything like that. Just go home and start composting, because that single gesture will be bigger than anything else you do. Because you will take that food waste that happens outside of your world and turn it into something really good in your world, and you will become one of those gardeners that is holding on to great agricultural soil. Compost is incredibly easy to make, and nobody in this room has any excuse not to make it. If you feel you do, stand up and I will now take you on. Because everybody can make it. There is a composting system out there for everyone. And in the simplest terms, if you just take all your garden waste and leave it in the corner of your garden, you're making compost. So you don't even have to work at it if you're not very used to it. Take that compost, put it back on your soil, you're feeding the microbes, you're feeding the plants, you're feeding the bees. And then grow some food. Because growing food in your back garden is a way to not waste food, it's a way to pull the whole thing back into a nice, easy loop. So that was the ending. But just before we leave, I just want to talk a little bit, because we agreed that you should make compost, and you're going to go home and immediately make compost. But also you should fill your garden. In the meantime, while we get between A and B with our bad agricultural problems, your back garden is the bees' only choice for a really good, clean, healthy meal. And every back garden, wherever they are, is a refuge from what's happening out in the agricultural fields. So go mad this summer and grow as many flowers as you possibly can. Please try and grow them from seeds, because if you grow them from seed, there's a good chance that the seed you're using, particularly if you use like any of the seed that's being sold down in the shop, for instance, any of those veg seeds. I mean, when I say flowers, you can make vegetable field flowers if you want. That are grown under nice, simple systems won't have a lot of pesticides and insecticides in them. Thompson and Morgan, some of the big seeds companies, do use fungicides on their seeds. Turn over the packet. If it says these seeds have been treated, don't buy them. Go and find a seed packet that says this seed hasn't been treated. Because you don't need to put all that rubbish back into the system. If you're going to go to the garden centre, be a really good consumer. You may have to make bad choices in the garden centre and buy plants that will have pesticide use in them. But every time you go and vote with your money and say, you know what, I want to buy more, I would love to buy a whole garden worth of bedding plants, but your bedding plants have got pesticides and insecticides, I don't want to bring into my garden. You're making a choice and a vote that will go back down. So every flower design has nothing to do with pleasing us, but is there just to please the bees and show them where they should go to and tell them, you know, how they should open. And, you know, like, we don't have enough time to go into it, but how flowers have evolved to attract bees is an extraordinary thing. And the level that they will go to do it. I mean, think about think about a bee orchid, which is a terrestrial orchid that looks and smells just like a female bumblebee to a male bumblebee. And male bumblebees never get to have enough sex. They are permanently, like less than 5% of male bumblebees will ever have sex. Everybody else dies a virgin. So they are just obsessed with trying to have sex with anything all the time. And they're only looking for a queen to have, right? And then they have really big eyes, so they can try and find him, but they're not really very good at it. And that's why you often find in the summer, you'll see like a gang of male bumblebees. You know, they don't have a stick, so that's how pointy bottom female, flat bottom male. And you'll see a gang of them going often along hedgerows, and then sometimes you find them on top of hills, just hanging out. They go, because they have such a, like, they know they have a really, well, maybe they must on some level know that they have a very limited chance. So they have this route that they police endlessly, trying to hope that at some point the queen will fly into it. So they're like a kind of gang of, they're like a stag night, kind of going endlessly around the walls like this. They often get drunk. They're really notorious, male bumblebees, to go and get over-fermented sugars off a plant that's either over-fermented sugar or an apple that's rotting or something like that. They go and get drunk and they police their world, flying round and round and round with the hope that a female longer people come along. And then they get drunk, and then they're known to congregate on top of hills and have fights.